killed 1 million people just to pretty much say, we're not going to be messed with. And these religious leaders, these Pharisees and Sadducees, they ceased to exist after this moment. So you just can't compete. There's always going to be somebody more evil than you. Now, before we get done with Judas' story, Matthew gives us this little footnote about the 30 pieces of silver. And in verse number 6, he says, the chief priest took the pieces of silver and said, it is not lawful to put them into the temple treasury, since it is the price of blood. And they conferred together, and with the money bought the potter's field as a burial place for strangers. For this reason that field's been called the field of blood to this day. Then that which was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one whose price had been set by the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord directed me. The money Judas threw into the temple, it could not by law be kept by the priest, since it was gained through a conspiracy. And as Matthew, in verse number 6, it says it was illegal for the temple treasury to benefit from funds obtained through dishonest means. Again, these law-abiding chief priests here, and they couldn't give the money back to Judas because he was dead. So they decided to use the money and purchase a field to bury strangers, travelers who just died in the area. And Matthew tells us that that was to fulfill Scripture. And he quotes both from Jeremiah and Zechariah. And so now Jesus stands before Pilate, and Pilate begins his interrogation in verse number 11. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor questioned him, saying, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus said to him, it is as you say. And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he did not answer. Then Pilate said to him, do you not hear how many things they testify against you? And he did not answer him with regard to even a single charge. So the governor was quite amazed. Right away, we can tell Pilate's not super impressed with Jesus. And he also doesn't really even believe these charges of insurrection. Notice Pilate, he asked Jesus if he says, are you the king of the Jews? And this is the first time that this has been used. I mean, imagine Jesus' appearance right now. He's bloody. He's exhausted. Some of his beard's been torn out. He's bound. I mean, obviously the religious leaders told Pilate of this charge, but without Judas to testify against Jesus, Pilate needs proof. I mean, if you get a speeding ticket and you go to court and the police officer that wrote the ticket doesn't show up, your accuser isn't there, and the judge just says, okay, well, I guess you can just leave. So Pilate, he doesn't have any choice. He has to ask Jesus to confirm or to deny these charges. Now, if Jesus had just simply denied the charges, then he would have been set free by Pilate, because there wasn't anybody there to testify against him. Because the night before, the religious leaders brought Judas. Judas isn't there anymore. So all it would take is just one denial from Jesus, and the whole entire thing is over. And that's why Scripture says that Jesus had to remain silent. Isaiah 53:7 says he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers. So he did not open his mouth. Now, obviously, Jesus talked. I mean, other Gospels have this whole dialogue between Jesus and Pilate. What they're talking about here is Jesus, he did nothing to defend himself. He didn't stop the process of going to the cross. And we have to, and we ask, well, why not? Well, because as Isaiah said, the Lord caused our iniquity to fall upon Jesus. The verse before that, verse 6, in Isaiah 53 says, all of us like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way. But the Lord has caused the iniquity of all of us to fall on him. So when Pilate asked Jesus if he's the king of the Jews, Jesus simply says, as you say. Now, of course, Jesus is the king of the Jews, and he's also the king of Pilate and the Romans and everybody else. But his kingdom doesn't appear on earth until much later, so for now his claims just look ridiculous to people like Pilate. And so imagine this scene. Jesus is standing. He's bound, bloody before Pilate. He's looking pitiful, altogether unimpressive. But you also have these religious leaders who are standing nearby, and they're concerned that, Jesus is going to get out of these charges at any moment, because all he's got to do is open his mouth. All he's got to do is say something. Or he can't, say no, and it's done. But they stand outside in the doorway. Okay, they're decked out in their little robes and their precious things, and they don't go in, according to John's gospel, because they won't be defiled by the Gentiles on the Passover. Yet they're standing outside acting like a lunatic mob, shouting out false charges against Jesus as Pilate looks on. There's probably no moment recorded in the Gospels that reveal the wicked hearts of these men better than this one. Here they are, appearing pious, not even willing to enter into the building for fear of being defiled. But on the other hand, they're standing outside just lying and conspiring to pervert justice, two of the worst crimes under the law. So Pilate turns back to Jesus in verse 13 in wonder at the fact that Jesus isn't even responding. He's not denying the charges. Pilate had to suspect that the religious leaders were giving false testimony, and he just fully expects Jesus to say so. And yet Jesus doesn't say anything. And so Pilate's like, do you not hear? Do you not hear all the many things that they testify against you? And of course, Jesus just remains silent against his accusers. He's not even refuting a single charge. Now, Matthew's account skips over a whole lot at this point, and John explains it in great detail. And if it wasn't such a serious situation, it would actually look kind of comical. Because you got Pilate, he's wavering back and forth between worrying about condemning an innocent man, worrying about if the Jews are going to riot if he sets Jesus free, and mostly Pilate's just worried about losing control and losing his job. And, when you're worried about that, it leaves you open to manipulation by pretty much everyone. And so in John's gospel, Pilate's like shuttling back and forth between like talking to Jesus and then going to talk to the Jewish leaders outside. I mean, he is the governor of a Roman province, and he is bouncing around like a ping pong ball trying to find his way out of this mess. And John tells us that as Jesus and Pilate talked, Jesus gets Pilate to acknowledge that he didn't care. He cares nothing of Jesus' claims to be king. I mean, Pilate doesn't believe in Jesus' claims, and he would just prefer to release him since Pilate doesn't take any pleasure in condemning innocent men. But Jesus won't give Pilate the easy escape that Pilate seeks. And at one point, Jesus even tells Pilate, dude, you have no control over me. And, I mean, Pilate didn't have any control over anything else either. And even though Matthew doesn't record it, we know that Pilate sends Jesus to King Herod, who just, had some fun with Jesus and sends him back. And Pilate knows that Jesus is innocent. In fact, like on 5 separate occasions, Pilate tries to declare that he finds no guilt in Jesus. But at the same time, he's struck by these religious leaders who are just, absolutely determined to see Jesus put to death. And Mark even tells us that Pilate had figured out that they were just purely acting out of spite against Jesus. So now he can't decide what's worse, convict an innocent man or release Jesus at the risk of a Jewish riot at Passover. So Pilate lands on this scheme. Okay, and here's what this scheme is, and he's going to try to get the Jewish crowd to get him out of this mess. Verse 15 says, "Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the people any one prisoner who they wanted. At that time, they were holding a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when the people gathered together, Pilate said to them, 'Who do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who's called Christ?' For he knew that because of envy they had handed him over. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent him a message saying, 'Have nothing to do with this righteous man, for last night I suffered greatly in a dream because of him.' But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to put Jesus to death." A tradition had begun during the time of Roman control in Judea to release one Jewish prisoner during the crowds to Passover. Now, Passover in Jerusalem was always a time of unrest and agitation. So, this was their 4th of July. And the Romans, believe it or not, they valued peace and stability above virtually anything else. So they were looking for a way to please the crowds. And they came across this practice of releasing a Jewish prisoner to the crowds each Passover, kind of just like a goodwill gesture. So Pilate's kind of hoping that this tradition is going to be his get-out-of-jail-free card. All right, it's going to bypass the pressure of the Jewish leaders while also pleasing the crowd. Now, to ensure Jesus is the one selected, he arranges for this guy Barabbas. And Pilate's hope, his hope, is that the crowd's choice is going to be super easy and extremely obvious. Because by all accounts, Barabbas was not a very liked person. Matthew says he was notorious, which just means that everybody knew he was a troublemaker. John's gospel says that he was a robber, and in the book of Acts, we're told that he was also a murderer. And Luke tells us that this particular arrest, he was leading an insurrection against Roman authorities. So the guy's nothing but trouble. Pilate assumes there's no way that the crowd's going to want to release someone like Barabbas. Now, in contrast to Barabbas, Pilate expects that the sight of Jesus will likely generate some sympathy. By this point, I mean, Jesus, he's been roughed up pretty bad. His face is bloody. He's bruised. He endured a night of abuse. He's exhausted. He was pitiful. So surely the people are going to favor Jesus, especially in comparison to this Barabbas guy. Now, in verse 17, Pilate sits himself on the judgment seat. He brings the two men out before the crowd. And then Pilate puts the question out, who do you want me to release? But there's this brief pause as the crowd is contemplating this choice. The religious leaders are getting nervous that they're going to fall for Pilate's plan and release Jesus. But before the crowd can answer, Pilate gets interrupted by this urgent note sent from his wife. So Pilate suspends the proceedings and excuses himself. So Pilate leaves the two men and the crowd, and he goes to see what the note is. So he goes back into the fortress. He reads the note from his wife about her dream and that she suffered greatly, and he needs to leave this righteous man alone. And like most husbands, Pilate just stupidly ignores his wife's counsel, and he goes back to the proceedings. So we got to wonder, well, what was the point of the dream? Why did the Lord give her this dream? What was he trying to accomplish? And there's really two answers there. First is the church tradition going back to the first century. It maintains that this woman's name was Claudia. And the tradition says that, unlike her husband, she came to faith in Jesus based on this dream and the testimony of the disciples. Now imagine what kind of powerful circle that she's in and what kind of powerful witness that's going to be to her group of friends that she has. This is kind of on the same level as Saul, aka Paul, as far as, having such a powerful witness to the people around her. And the second reason for the dream is it shows God's sovereignty in a particularly ironic way. Okay? This note that she sends is meant to save Jesus' life. But when Pilate leaves to go and read the note, that delay gives the religious leaders their opportunity to influence the outcome the way that they wanted it to. So the note that was meant to save ends up being the pause that ends up not having Pilate's plan work the way he wants to. So Pilate comes back from dealing with the note. He sits down on the judgment seat, and he starts to commence with his plan to give the crowd their choice. And in verse 21 it says, "But the governor said to them, 'Which of the two do you want me to release to you?' And they said, 'Barabbas.' And Pilate said to them, 'Well then, what do you want me to do with Jesus, who's called Christ?' And they said, 'Crucify him.' And he said, 'Why? What evil has he done?' But they just kept shouting all the more, saying, 'Crucify him.' And when Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, but rather that a riot was starting, he took water, washed his hands in front of the crowd, saying, 'I am innocent of this man's blood. See to that yourselves.' And all the people said, 'His blood shall be on us and our children.'" So Pilate's plan to release Jesus has gone epically wrong, and he plays right into the hands of the Jewish leaders. And Pilate's really astonished, he can't believe it. And he even asks again, what evil has Jesus done to deserve this? And the crowd doesn't know what to say. They just know they're supposed to yell, "Crucify him." Now, Matthew only records Pilate asking the crowd just this one time, but throughout the Gospels, Pilate asked the crowd 3 times. And in fact, at one point, Pilate even goes as far as to take Jesus away and have him scourged in the hope that it would increase sympathy for Jesus. Now, next week, we'll cover the effects of that, but right now, you just need to know it was devastating. When they brought Jesus back out from that, it was just he barely looked human. And there was still no sympathy for him, despite that. So altogether, the Gospels record Pilate trying to release Jesus 5 times. And each time the crowd they grow more vehement in their demands. Finally, Pilate just realizes he's in danger of starting the very riot that he was trying to avoid anyway. Knows that he's beaten, so he pronounces Jesus will die despite being innocent. Now, Pilate will put Jesus to death, and Barabbas will be released. And in that moment, the Lord's sovereignty is on display for us again. On one side stood Yeshua, which is the Hebrew name for Jesus, the Son of the Father. And on the other side is Barabbas, a criminal. And that wasn't even his real name. It's just a Greek transliteration of a Hebrew title. The term Bar-Abbas in Hebrew just means son of Abbas, and Abba is the Aramaic word for father. So he was called Son of the Father. And church records show that his name was Yeshua. Now, that was just a very common Jewish name in the day, but what that means is that on that day, on both sides of Pilate, stood 2 men, both called Yeshua, Son of the Father. And God had prepared that moment such that Jesus and Barabbas would serve as federal representatives of their respective spiritual families. You have Barabbas,